episode of the Classic English Literature Subcast, where a little more rhyme gets a little more reason. This is the second in an occasional series I've been calling the Out of Time episodes, and these are shows on topics I missed at their appropriate time in the podcast's chronology. I hope you like today's little foray in the Wayback Machine. We're headed once again to late medieval England and the forests around Nottingham. Yes, we're going to drop in on that greatest of heroic outlaws, Robin Hood. So let's fire her up. Here we are. Oops. Give it a shove. Good shove. The door sticks. Ah, the Greenwood Forest. I'm sure most of you listening have some knowledge or experience with Robin Hood. I imagine that cinema is the biggest distributor of his legend nowadays. There have been millions of film adaptations of his legend. The first full-length one goes back to 1922, but there were some short films made as early as 1908. Probably the 1938 Errol Flynn movie is the most iconic. And I have to admit, I've got a nostalgic fondness for the 1973 Disney animated film, Robin Hood is a Fox, which I admit kinda sheepishly, because I'm generally anti-Walt, but I like that one. Sean Connery, Kevin Costner, Russell Crowe have all made memorable appearances as the Merry Outlaw, though with quite varying degrees of success. What most people know about Robin Hood is this. He is a nobleman who went to fight in the Crusades. When he returns, the Sheriff of Nottingham, under the auspices of a usurping King John, dispossesses Robin Hood, who must flee into Sherwood Forest. There he meets a group of outlaws, each hiding for his own particular reason, but all suffering the tyrannic depredations of an unjust ruler. We have Little John, Friar Tuck, Will Scarlet, Alan a Dale. There's even a love interest, the charming Maid Marian, also a fox in the cartoon. Together, Robin and his band thwart the machinations of the sheriff and his minions, robbing from the rich and giving to the poor, escaping back into the forest for a merry feast. At least that's the main version promulgated in modern popular culture. And I'm not implying there's anything wrong with it. It's a ripping yarn. In fact, any alteration or embroidery of Robin Hood's adventures by whomever is actually as valid as any other. Because you see, there's no canonical text for the Robin Hood legends. Any new tale is just an expansion of the mythos, which I think is rather cool. Like King Arthur, Robin Hood is still a thriving story, endlessly reimagined and repurposed for new times and new contexts. So what I want to do with this episode is not to give you, the real Robin Hood story, because there isn't one. But I thought you might be interested in some of the earliest tales surrounding the dashing outlaw, and how those early campfire stories and tavern songs grew into one of the greatest legendary figures in English literature. Our earliest reference to the existence of such tales comes from our old friend William Langland, the fellow who wrote the great medieval allegory The Vision of Piers Plowman in 1377, and we covered that way back in episode 11. In passus 5 of that poem, the character Sloth admits that, quote, I can nocht perfectly my paternoster as the priest it singeth, but I can a remus of Robin Hood and of Randolph Earl of Chester. So he doesn't know his Lord's Prayer too well, but he can recite poems about Robin Hood. It sounds like my dad when I was a kid, right? My dad's an engineer, and he just couldn't understand why I didn't get algebra and calculus, and he'd say, well, you managed to memorize all the Beatles lyrics, though. Yeah, he's right. About 40 years after Langland, we also get a passing reference to our hero in Andrew of Winton's original Chronicle of Scotland. He mentions Robin Hood and Little John as outlaws in the Inglewood Forest area. Quote, Little John and Robin Hood, waithmen were commended good. In Englewood and Barnesdale they ousted all their time with their travail. Now these sparse references do little more than indicate that tales circulated orally. But we don't yet have a sense of the epic heroism that we know now. We can assume a certain romantic popularity. Now, in fact, when anything gets popular, in 1440, Walter Bower gets a bit moralistic about Robin Hood in his book called the Scotichronicon. Quote, Then arose the famous murderer, Robin Hood, as well as Little John, alongside their accomplices, from whom the vulgar rabble extract so much pleasure in those ballads which are sung about them. Ooh, I sense the beginnings of a moral panic here. Kids today with their rap music and their video games and their Robin Hood ballads, what's this world coming to? But, the lemon-sucking Mr. Bower may have a point. The earliest stories about Robin Hood do seem to glamorize outlawry for its own transgressive sake. One of the first ballads that survives in manuscript is from about the same time as the Scotichronicon, mid-1400s or so, and it's called Robin Hood and the Monk. As a ballad, it generally makes use of an A-B-C-B stanza, sometimes lapsing into an A-B-A-B rhyme scheme, and it may have been sung, but probably more likely it was recited. It survives in a single manuscript, lovingly tucked up in the archives of Cambridge University, and while it provides a complete narrative and does contribute somewhat to the shaping of later legends, it also shows some marked differences from the stories that we may be familiar with from film and TV and such. As the story begins, Robin Hood expresses a desire to attend Mass in Nottingham. Little John warns that it's too dangerous, and Much the Miller's son says you should bring some bodyguards. But Robin takes only Little John, whom he manages to anger by losing a bet on the way and disagreeing as to the payout. John stalks off. Once at church, a monk who knows Robin betrays him to the sheriff of Nottingham, and our hero gets thrown in chokey. Little John learns of this, and, with Much the Miller's son, ambushes the monk and his page on their way to inform the king. Disguising themselves as royal messengers, John and Much deliver false news to the king and trick the sheriff into releasing Robin. Robin apologizes to John about the bet, and the men reconcile. When the king later realizes that he has been duped, he marvels at the outlaws' loyalty to each other and lets it go as a merry jest. While it's a rollicking good tale, we see little evidence at this point of a beloved warrior for justice. Robin does seem to have a great devotion to the Virgin Mary, which echoes the courtly love ethic we discussed before, and that's the prompt for his trip to Nottingham. But this religious obligation and devotion takes him out of his Edenic forest and into the dangerous world of civil society. There's this crossing of a threshold here, which the poem is very concerned with. Quote, In summer when the shaws be sheen and laves be large and long, it is full merry in fair forest to hear the fowler's song. To see the deer draw to the dale, and lave the hill is high, and shadow him in the lavis grain under the grainwood tray. We start, like Chaucer did in his general prologue, in the blossom of summer, in a vital nature. But this paradise is interrupted by chance, randomness. Stanza 3 begins, quote, "It befell on Whitsuntide." Like, it just so happened. Robin happens to feel uncomfortable, regretful that he's not been to Mass for 2 weeks. And so we see an interruption in the natural bliss by institutional obligation. There follows a further breach in the harmony of rustic living when John suggests a shooting contest. Quote, "And we will shoot a penny," said Little John, "under the greenwood line." Note that line is sort of a semi-refrain of the earlier one, line 8. It's another subtle example of the poem's concern with rupture and disruption. After a bit of wrangling, the two men shoot, and the upshot sees Little John 5 shillings to the good. But Robin refuses to pay, calls John a liar, and smacks him up the head. John draws his sword. Quote, "Were thou not my maester," said Little John, "thou shouldest by hit full sore get a man where thou willa, for thou gettest me no more." So here's the great split, the great rupture. Once out of the forest, there is a dispute over leadership. The order that prevailed in the first quatrains dissolves as the characters move further into the civil world. We also see, however, that Robin's leadership is by consent. John can walk away if he feels that he has been unjustly dealt with. Now, this stands in marked contrast to the feudal and ecclesiastical obligations of medieval society. I am intrigued, though, by the somewhat inconsistent duty of loyalty in the poem. Certainly, when the monk betrays Robin Hood, and that's how we're supposed to see it, right? We're supposed to see it as betrayal. He seems disloyal to this local yeoman, but really, he's entirely loyal to the local authorities. And, yes, to a certain vengeance for Robin's theft of his 100 pounds. In the following fracas, Robin Hood kills 12 men and wounded, quote, "many a mother's son." Little John's vengeance on the monk, too, is extrajudicially violent. Quote, "John smote off the monk's head, no longer would he dwell, so much did for the little page, for fear lest he would tell." Right, so John is still loyal to his erstwhile master, but we're now up to 14 deaths. After Robin's rescue, John turns away, but Robin stops him and offers him the leadership of the forest band. Quote, "I make thee master," said Robin Hood, "of all my men and me." But Little John refuses this magnanimous admission of guilt, saying, quote, "Nay, be me troth," said Little John, "so shall it never be. But let me be a fellow," said Little John, "no note or cape I be." John requests not to be the leader, but a fellow. And the king, when he realizes how Little John beguiled both himself and the sheriff, dismisses the matter because, quote, "he is true to his master." Robin Hood and the monk, then, presents a proto-democratic sense of loyalty, a faithfulness to the comrade and to the local, rather than the institutional and the distant. Other tales will generally uphold this dynamic, though those tales in which Robin is a crusader returned to an England usurped by wicked King John, loyalty to the imprisoned Richard the Lionheart conflates these obligations. On the other hand, if we stand outside the normative perspective, that is, the assumption that we are intended to root for Robin and his men, and try to look at the tale dispassionately, there's not much to like about the putative hero. He's proud and headstrong. He cheats and lies, abuses his boon companion. He's a thief, if we're to believe the monk, and he's willing to kill to indulge his whims. As I've said, Little John, too, will kill to protect Robin. It's also worth noting that Robin needs protection. He's not the invincible hero to whom we've become accustomed. We've no intimation that the monk, the sheriff, or the king should be righteously opposed. They don't seem corrupt or tyrannical. Maybe the king's a bit foolish. Now, maybe there's a cultural context surrounding this ballad that would imply or assume that everyone would know about this clerical and political corruption, but it's not in the text. So perhaps Barlow isn't so off base in his worry that Robin Hood could corrupt vulnerable youth. In this tale, ripping yarn though it is, we get an early version of what we'd now call an anti-hero, a protagonist who lacks conventional heroic qualities, morally ambiguous, often selfish and self-destructive, yet still charismatic and compelling. Think Michael Corleone, or Lady Macbeth, actually. And Little John seems like a classic trickster figure from folklore and mythology. Later in the 15th century, we get a lengthy narrative poem called A Jest of Robin Hood. Jest with a G, not a J. Jest with a G is a heroic tale of notable deeds, a romance in verse. The word comes from the Latin gesta, meaning like exploits. We've got a couple of versions of this one, a 1490 edition by printer Richard Pinson, and a 1510 by William Caxton's former assistant and, for my money, bearer of history's greatest name for a publisher, Wynkyn de Worde. Nice. The jest is about 1,800 lines long, and it's divided into 8 parts called fits, just like Gawain and the Green Knight was, all those sections were called fits. And like another, actually, Arthurian landmark, Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, A Jest of Robin Hood also seems to compile a number of pre-existing tales and ballads into a more unified narrative structure. So it thus becomes the basis for many later retellings. Oh, and, standard ballad stanza, quatrain rhyming ABCB, suitable for lutenist accompaniment. The major events of the jest include Robin helping a poor knight, whom we later discover is named Sir Richard at the Lee, who is in debt to the Abbot of St. Mary's in York. Robin Hood generously lends him £400 to save his lands. Fit 1 opens with Little John urging his master to eat, but Robin will not do so unless he can dine with some toffee-nose and fleece him. Quote, "To dine have I no lust, till that I have some bold baron or some uncouth guest that may pay for the best, or some knight or some squire that dwelleth here by west." But, lest we think Robin a mere scoundrel, the speaker is quick to point out that Robin attends 3 masses before he dines, one for the Father, one for the Ghost, and one for the Holy Lady. It's this last devotion that animates the opening tale. Robin sends his men out to find a wealthy nobleman or ecclesiast to rob, but he warns, quote, "But look ye do no husband harm that tilleth with his plough. No more shall ye no good yeoman that walketh by green shaw, nor no knight, nor no squire that will be a good fellow. These bishops and these archbishops ye shall them beat and bind. The high sheriff of Nottingham, him hold ye in your mind." Oh, make Sherwood great again. This is class warfare, a populist revolt against the elites. But Little John and the others come upon a wretched-looking old knight. Quote, "All dreary was his semblance, and little was his pride." He's taken back to the forest and dines lavishly with Robin, who, after the pudding, demands payment because he says, quote, "It was never the manner, by dear worthy God, a yeoman to pay for a knight." But the knight has no money, only 10 shillings, because he's fallen on hard times paying debts for his son. He needs £400 to clear those debts, which are now held by a wealthy abbot. Robin, of course, stands him the money because, he's a good fellow, with a similarly ardent devotion to Our Lady. The other men say, "Well, he needs some new clothes too, Rob. And a fresh horse. Get him a palfrey. And new boots." Well, hell, this is the knight's lucky day. He journeys to York to discharge his debt and comes upon the abbot, a fat-headed monk who is the abbey's cellarer. The cellarer is the guy who's in charge of the food and drink at the abbey. Is also the High Justice of England and the sheriff, and they're gorging themselves at table. When the knight enters, quote, "The first word the abbot spoke, 'Hast thou brought my pay?'" Rather rude. But what should one expect from the medieval literary depiction of clergy? Not a very flattering time. The knight says he hasn't the readies and wishes more time. He appeals to the High Justice, who spurns him. He turns to the sheriff, who does likewise. All power, civil and religious, abandons this poor father in his hour of need. Then, in a flourish, he dumps the cash on a table. I like to think he gives his creditor a one-fingered salute and returns home a happy man, thanks to the generosity of that stout yeoman, Robin Hood. The jest, from its very first tale, establishes a different Robin Hood than we saw in the earlier ballad. This Robin is more devout, seeming to act in Christian charity rather than simply affect it. He's still a yeoman, not the nobleman of later tellings, and so his sympathies are indeed morally grounded in a sense of social justice and a hatred of the depredations of the elite. It's not as simple as poor is good, rich is bad. The knight is of the aristocracy, but he's an upright man. And the prior of St. Mary's, too, questions the abbot's harsh dealings with the knight. So the emphasis, it's very like that found in The Wife of Bath's Tale, if you remember that Chaucer episode. The old crone gives the pillow talk to her new and very reluctant husband, arguing that nobility is in what one does, not the rank to which one is born. We may also sense, of course, the direction of God's providence in the serendipitous coming together of the knight and the outlaw. Fit 3 begins with an outrageous sketch. Little John, pretending to be a geezer called Reynold Greenleaf, becomes the sheriff's man, intending to, quote, "be the worst servant to him that ever yet had he." John manages to relieve the sheriff of his cook and all his silver, which of course make their way into the greenwood to Robin. John cozens the sheriff about a magical deer, which leads to the feckless officer enjoying Robin's hospitality. Fit 4 opens with similar language to Fit 1, and with echoes of the exposition in Robin Hood and the Monk. There's more talk about the Virgin Mary and sending his men to find some hapless mark to toy with over a sumptuous forest dinner. This time, turns out it's a couple of, quote, black monks, so Dominicans probably, and they, of course, are quite rude to their host. It turns out, they're from St. Mary's in York, and one of them is the fat-headed cellarer from the first tale. Who'd have thought? Robin recalls his assistance to the poor knight and teasingly assumes that the monks are here to repay the knight's debt. Get a parallel conversation to that with the knight, in which Robin asks how much money they have. They say, well, not much, and John checks the bags, but unlike the knight, of course, they are lying. Little John produces £800 from their saddlebags. One of the monks protests Robin's audacious views of hospitality. Quote, "By Our Lady, then," said the monk, "that were no courtesy to bid a man to dinner and sith him beat and bind." "It is our old manner," said Robin, "to leave but little behind." I love that dry retort. Like all these tales, despite the clear condemnation of clerical corruption and political tyranny, they're all delivered in a playful tone. Understatement, verbal irony, even a sense of the whimsical and absurd. Though the social issues addressed are grave, and would certainly strike most listeners as quite relevant to their lives, the balladeer here never gets too heavy. The villains are stock, flat, cardboard villains. Cartoon bad guys, and Robin's gang really just tweak their noses, so to speak. Well, maybe more than a nose tweak. But it's all a merry jape, and wealth redistribution is just the right thing to do, eh? So have a drink and a laugh. The formerly poor knight returns, by the way, offers Robin the 400 pounds he borrowed, plus a bit of a tip, 20 marks. Robin turns it down, as the cellarer has already repaid the debt. Ho ho! In fact, I'll give 400 pounds to you, because the cellarer overpaid me. Ha ha! Merry days. Fit 5 gives us the famous shooting contest. That's the one that features prominently in the Disney animation. Robin wins the contest, but he's betrayed by the sheriff. A battle ensues. Little John and others are wounded. They retreat to the castle of, you guessed it, the poor knight Richard at the Lee, whom Robin helped. The sheriff lays siege to the castle and then hies himself to the king for assistance, who promises to be in Nottingham in a fortnight. The king here, though, is most likely Edward III and not King John, as many later retellings have it. Robin encounters the sheriff in town, shoots him, chops off his head, crying, quote, "Lie thou there, thou proud sheriff, evil mote they achieve. There might no man to thee trust the whiles thou were alive." The king offers Sir Richard's lands to any man who captures Robin Hood. But an old knight says that no man is willing to take that risk. So the king potters around Nottingham for 6 months, getting angrier and angrier at the merry men's impunitive poaching, until a plot is hit upon by which the king will disguise himself as a monk and penetrate Robin's defenses. When they meet, Robin tells the disguised king, quote, "We be yeomen of this forest under the greenwood tree. We live by our king's deer, other shift have not we. And ye have churches and rents both, and gold full great plenty. Give us some of your spending for Saint Charity." The monk king gives Robin 40 pounds, half of which he gives to the men, and the other half he returns. This act of justice and generosity prompts the king to offer Robin the royal seal. He marvels at the loyalty of Robin's men and at the liberality of Robin's feasting. The good king reveals himself and pardons our hero, who is allowed to serve at court. But again, like Arthur, we have a somewhat tragic and treacherous ending. After years, Robin returns to the forest, but he's betrayed by the Princess of Kirklees and Sir Roger of Doncaster, who, quote, "took together their counsel Robin Hood for to slay." He is bled to death in a monastery, and this gives us one of the earliest versions of Robin Hood's death. The jest ends with a benediction that draws a clear distinction between morality and legality, between what is right and what the law permits. Quote, "Christ have mercy on his soul that died on the rood, for he was a good outlaw and did poor men much good." You know what? It strikes me just now, like really this very second, that this closing quatrain is rather ambiguous. I mean, grammatically, it could just as well be about Jesus Christ as it is about Robin Hood. See, look, the words, quote, "that died upon the rood," the rood is the cross, right? The words that died upon the rood are what's called a restrictive clause, which means that they provide essential information about the preceding noun, his soul. So that means the soul of the one who died upon the cross. So, Jesus. And of course, Jesus did that dying because he was an outlaw, executed for crimes against religion and state, crimes he believed were to the benefit of the poor and the neglected in society. That's quite tasty, that. I'm not usually much for Christ figures in literature. They're usually pretty heavy-handed symbolically, right? I mean, subtle as a neon sledgehammer to the danglies, as I say. Especially if the writer gives the character, like, the initials JC, like Jim Conklin in The Red Badge of Courage, or Jim Casey in The Grapes of Wrath, John Coffey in The Green Mile. Note that all these are American authors. Shots fired! But I'm rather pleased with the jest's final stanza. I mean, I know what the balladeer literally means, but the grammatical structure undercuts it, and it opens a wider way of seeing Robin's heroism. So, that's a little look at some of the earliest and most influential texts in the Robin Hood universe. There are hundreds more. We've got plays by Anthony Munday. We've even got a play by Ben Jonson. And then, just hundreds of tales and ballads and songs. And, you should check out the University of Rochester. It has a great site called the Robin Hood Project. I'll put a link in the show notes. A veritable cornucopia of all things Hood. I hope you enjoyed this Out of Time episode. Please take a moment to leave a 5-star review on your podcatcher of choice. The algorithm really likes that. Tell all your friends about the good times we have. Hit the support the show button if you want to buy me a beer and the cat some cream. We'll be back in the 17th century next time, and I hope to see you there.